Part 1 Introduction: The Rise of Communist States. In the 20th century, few political ideas reshaped the world as dramatically as communism. From revolutions and civil wars to industrial transformation and global ideological battles, communist governments rose across multiple continents. At their peak, nearly one-third of the world's population lived under communist rule. But while many communist experiments collapsed or struggled economically, a few countries managed to achieve significant stability, industrial development, or global influence. So today, we're exploring the top 5 most successful communist countries in history. These countries succeeded in different ways. Some built powerful industrial economies. Some dramatically reduced poverty and improved education. Others survived decades of sanctions, wars, and international pressure. But before we explore those countries, we need to understand what communism actually is, and how it came to shape global politics. The roots of communist ideology trace back to the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In 1848, they published the influential book The Communist Manifesto. Their theory argued that society was divided into classes, primarily the working class and the capitalist class. Marx believed that eventually workers would overthrow capitalist systems and establish a society where wealth and resources were owned collectively. This idea inspired political movements across Europe and later across the world. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that communism would first take power in a major nation. That moment arrived in 1917. During the Russian Revolution, revolutionaries led by Vladimir Lenin overthrew the Russian monarchy. The new government soon formed the Soviet Union, the world's first communist superpower. Over the following decades, communist movements spread across Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Some revolutions succeeded, others failed. But several countries built lasting communist systems that shaped the course of global history. Today we'll examine 5 of them. Each one followed a different path. Each faced different challenges. And each left a complex legacy that historians still debate today. Our list focuses on countries that achieved significant economic development, political stability, or global influence while maintaining communist or socialist systems. The 5 countries we will explore are China, Vietnam, Cuba, the Soviet Union, Laos. Some of these countries remain communist today. Others no longer exist. But all of them played major roles in shaping the modern world. Let's begin with the most powerful communist country on Earth today. Part 2: China, the communist superpower. For our first country is China. Today, China is the second largest economy in the world and a global technological powerhouse. But its journey to that position began with revolution. In the early 20th century, China was politically unstable. Foreign powers controlled parts of its territory. Civil wars and economic hardship plagued the country. During the 1930s and 1940s, 2 major political forces fought for control of China. One was the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek. The other was the communist movement led by Mao Zedong. After years of civil war, the communists eventually emerged victorious. In 1949, Mao Zedong declared the creation of the People's Republic of China. The new communist government introduced massive economic and social reforms. Land owned by wealthy landlords was redistributed to peasants. Large industries were nationalized. The state began directing economic production. However, the early years of communist China were also marked by major challenges. One of the most controversial policies was the Great Leap Forward. This program aimed to rapidly transform China from an agricultural society into an industrial power. Poor planning and unrealistic production goals caused widespread economic disruption. The result was a devastating famine that killed millions. Later, China experienced another period of upheaval during the Cultural Revolution. This movement sought to remove political opponents and reinforce communist ideology. Universities closed. Intellectuals were persecuted. Millions of people were displaced or imprisoned. Despite these turbulent periods, China's long-term transformation was dramatic. After Mao's death in 1976, China began a new phase of reform. The country's leadership gradually introduced market-oriented economic policies, while maintaining political control by the Chinese Communist Party. These reforms were led by Deng Xiaoping. Under Deng's leadership, China opened its economy to global trade and foreign investment. Special economic zones were created. Private businesses began to emerge. Manufacturing expanded rapidly. Over the next 4 decades, China experienced one of the fastest economic transformations in human history. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. Cities expanded at an incredible pace. China became a global manufacturing center. Today, the country leads the world in areas such as infrastructure development, high-speed rail networks, and industrial production. Despite maintaining a communist political system, China's economic model now combines state planning with market mechanisms. This hybrid system has allowed China to achieve remarkable economic growth. However, the country's political system remains tightly controlled. The Communist Party continues to dominate all aspects of governance. This combination of economic dynamism and political centralization makes China one of the most unique communist systems ever created. But China is not the only country where communism reshaped society. Another nation in Southeast Asia followed a similar revolutionary path. Part 3: Vietnam. From war to economic growth. Our second country is Vietnam. Vietnam's communist history is deeply connected to its struggle for independence. For decades, Vietnam was under French colonial rule. But during the early 20th century, nationalist movements began pushing for independence. One of the most influential leaders of that movement was Ho Chi Minh. Inspired by communist ideology, Ho Chi Minh led a revolutionary movement seeking both independence and social transformation. After World War II, Vietnam declared independence from France. However, conflict soon erupted. This war eventually became known as the First Indochina War. The conflict ended with Vietnam divided into 2 separate states. North Vietnam became communist. South Vietnam remained anti-communist. The division eventually led to one of the most famous conflicts of the Cold War, the Vietnam War. The war involved massive military intervention by the United States. For years, the conflict devastated the region. But in 1975, communist forces captured Saigon. Vietnam was reunified under a communist government. After the war, the country faced enormous economic challenges. Infrastructure was destroyed. The economy was weak. Food shortages were common. However, in the late 1980s, Vietnam introduced economic reforms known as Doi Moi. These reforms allowed private businesses and foreign investment while maintaining communist political leadership. The results were dramatic. Vietnam's economy began growing rapidly. Manufacturing expanded. Exports increased. Millions of people moved out of poverty. Today, Vietnam is one of the fastest-growing economies in Asia. It has become a major global exporter of electronics, textiles, and agricultural products. Despite these economic changes, Vietnam continues to be governed by the Communist Party of Vietnam. Its system, like China's, combines socialism with market reforms. This approach has allowed Vietnam to maintain political stability while achieving steady economic growth. But not all communist countries followed the same development path. Some faced extreme isolation and economic pressure. One of the most famous examples is the island nation of Cuba. Part 4: Cuba, the Caribbean Revolution. Our fourth example of a successful communist state is the island nation of Cuba. Located just 90 miles from the coast of the United States, Cuba became one of the most politically significant communist countries in the Western Hemisphere. But before the revolution, Cuba looked very different. During the early 20th century, Cuba's economy was heavily dependent on sugar production. Much of the country's wealth was concentrated among a small elite, while many rural communities lived in poverty. The island was also strongly influenced by the United States. American companies controlled large portions of Cuba's sugar industry, tourism sector, and infrastructure. Politically, the country was ruled by Fulgencio Batista. Batista's government was widely criticized for corruption, inequality, and repression. By the 1950s, opposition to the regime had grown dramatically. One of the most prominent opposition leaders was a young lawyer named Fidel Castro. Castro believed that Cuba needed radical political change. In 1953, he launched an attack on a military barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The attack failed, and Castro was arrested. However, during his trial he delivered a famous speech declaring, "History will absolve me." After being released from prison, Castro went into exile in Mexico. There he organized a revolutionary group determined to overthrow Batista's government. Among the members of this group was the Argentine revolutionary Che Guevara. In 1956, Castro and his followers returned to Cuba aboard a small boat called the Granma. Although many of the fighters were killed or captured, the surviving revolutionaries retreated into the mountains of the Sierra Maestra. From there, they began a guerrilla war against Batista's forces. Over the next 3 years, the revolutionary movement gained momentum. Public dissatisfaction with the Batista regime continued to grow. Finally, on January 1, 1959, Batista fled the country. Castro's forces marched into Havana. The Cuban Revolution had succeeded. Soon after taking power, Castro's government began implementing socialist reforms. Large industries and private businesses were nationalized. Land reforms redistributed farmland to peasants. Education and healthcare systems were expanded. But the revolution also dramatically changed Cuba's relationship with the United States. Washington grew increasingly concerned about Cuba's new socialist government. In 1961, tensions escalated dramatically during the Bay of Pigs invasion. The operation involved Cuban exiles trained by the United States attempting to overthrow Castro. The invasion failed within days. Instead of weakening Castro, it strengthened his position. Shortly afterward, Cuba officially declared itself a socialist state and aligned closely with the Soviet Union. This alliance led to one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. In 1962, the Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The discovery triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 tense days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Eventually, a diplomatic agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union resolved the crisis. But Cuba remained a communist state. Despite decades of economic sanctions from the United States, the Cuban government invested heavily in social programs. Education became universal. Literacy rates rose dramatically. Healthcare systems expanded across the country.